At 2 o'clock in the morning, the stars over forward operating base Keating burned so bright they looked fake, like someone had punched holes in a black canvas and backlit it with a spotlight. Stars you only saw in places God had forgotten and the United States military had quietly claimed. Colonel James Reeves stood at the eastern perimeter, his boots grinding against the hard-packed dirt, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the wire. At 68 years old, he moved like a man who'd learned to read landscapes the way other people read newspapers. Slowly, carefully, looking for what didn't belong. They called him Ghost. Had called him that since Quang Tri Province, 1969, when he'd spent 3 days behind enemy lines and walked back into his firebase like he'd just stepped out for coffee. 52 years later, the nickname still fit. He had a way of appearing where he wasn't expected and seeing things other people missed, like the woman checking the windows of the trauma bay for the third time in an hour. Most people thought she was just a contract nurse. Paid well, ate alone, kept her head down. The sort of medical professional who showed up, did her job, and disappeared into a containerized housing unit the size of a walk-in closet. Forgettable. Invisible. Ghost knew better. He'd been watching Sarah Morgan for 7 weeks. Not in a creepy way, in the way a man who'd spent 5 decades in uniform learned to watch people, looking for the tells, the patterns, the small things that separated tourists from travelers, and travelers from people who'd walk through fire and come out the other side with their hands steady. Sarah Morgan corner-checked. Every single time she crossed the FOB compound, her eyes swept the angles, cataloged the exits, and kept her back to solid surfaces. She moved with an economy of motion that most people mistook for efficiency, but Ghost recognized as training. Training you got from walking point patrol in places where every step might be your last. She was also scanning the southern approach again, the third time tonight, looking at the same stretch of scrubland that Ghost had been monitoring for the past 72 hours. Ghost's jaw tightened. He pulled a worn notebook from his pocket, the kind with a green canvas cover that had survived 3 wars, and made a note. Time, date, weather conditions, the position of the moon. Things that mattered when you were trying to predict whether tomorrow would be quiet or whether tomorrow would be the day the walls came down. He closed the notebook, looked back at Sarah Morgan. "I know what you are, girl," he said to the darkness. "Question is, does anyone else?" The generator hummed. Somewhere on the west side of the compound, someone was playing Johnny Cash, badly, on a guitar. A dog barked once and went silent. Quiet that felt heavy, pregnant with things not yet born. Ghost turned and walked toward the Tactical Operations Center. His knees hurt. His back hurt. Everything hurt at 68, but he'd learned a long time ago that pain was just information. Your body telling you it was still working, still in the fight, and Ghost wasn't done fighting yet. Vietnam, Quang Tri Province, March 1969. The jungle had a smell, rot and green and something else, a stench that burrowed into your lungs and stayed there long after you'd rotated home. Private First Class James Reeves was 20 years old and terrified in a way that made his hands shake every time he tried to light a cigarette. They'd been on patrol for 6 days. Force recon, the tip of the spear. The guys who went in first and came back, if they came back, with information that someone up the chain of command would use to make decisions that would get more guys killed. Reeves didn't think about that part. He thought about the next step, the next breath, the next moment when the world didn't explode into noise and blood. The ambush came at 1400 hours on a Tuesday. Reeves would remember that forever. Tuesday, like it mattered. Like the days of the week meant anything in a place where time was measured in firefights and body bags. The AK-47 rounds came from everywhere and nowhere, snapping through the canopy, chewing up the trail. Reeves hit the ground so hard he bit his tongue and tasted copper. Someone was screaming. Someone was always screaming. Then the grenade. He didn't see it. He just felt the pressure, the wave of force that picked him up and threw him sideways into a tree trunk that cracked 2 ribs and knocked the air out of his lungs in a single, violent exhale. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except lie there in the dirt with his vision going white at the edges and his chest making this awful clicking sound that meant something inside him was broken. Then there was a voice, female, calm, a calm that cut through panic like a knife through smoke. "I've got you, Marine. Stay with me." Hands on his chest, competent hands. Hands that knew where to press and where not to press, and how to turn his body just enough to get air back into his lungs without making the broken ribs punch through something vital. He blinked, focused. It was a woman, late 20s, Army uniform, captain's bars, covered in mud and blood, some of it hers, most of it not. She had brown eyes that didn't flinch when rounds snapped overhead, eyes that looked at him and saw a job to be done. "You're okay," she said, not asking, telling. "Ribs are broken, but lungs are intact. You're breathing. You're talking. You're going to walk out of here." Reeves tried to speak, couldn't. She kept working, bandages, pressure, the whole time talking to him in that voice, that steady, unbreakable voice that made him believe her, even though he could hear the firefight still raging 30 meters away. "My name is Captain Julia Henderson," she said. "I've been doing this for 2 years. I've pulled 63 Marines out of bad situations. You're number 64. And I don't lose patience, Marine. You understand? I don't lose patience." He understood. She saved his life that day. And when the firefight ended and the medevac birds came in and they loaded him onto a stretcher, he watched her move to the next wounded Marine, the next job, the next life to save. He never forgot her. And he never forgot the lesson she taught him without meaning to. Warriors came in forms you didn't expect. And if you were smart, you learned to recognize them. Not by their uniform or their rank or the things they said, but by what they did when everything went to hell. By their hands, by their calm, by the way they showed up and refused to leave until the job was done. Phoenix, Arizona. 6 months before Forward Operating Base Keating, Sarah Morgan stood in a 1-bedroom apartment that didn't feel like home because home was a concept she'd given up on somewhere between her 2nd and 3rd deployment to Helmand Province. The apartment had furniture, a bed, a kitchen table, things that normal people accumulated when they stayed in one place long enough to pretend they belonged there. Sarah didn't belong anywhere, not anymore. She was packing the same olive drab duffel bag she'd been packing since she was 18 years old. The same 3 t-shirts, the same running shoes with 200 miles on them, the same dog-eared copy of Marine Corps warfighting doctrine that she could still recite from memory if someone put a gun to her head. On the nightstand, 2 photographs. The first was 6 women in body armor, standing in a dusty Afghan village, arms around each other, grinning at the camera like they just won something. Female Engagement Team, Lioness Program, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. The first women the Marine Corps had ever attached to infantry combat patrols. Pioneers, they'd called them. Guinea pigs, Sarah had thought at the time. 5 of those 6 women were still alive. The second photograph was harder to look at. Elena Martinez, Hawk, 24 years old, dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that could light up a firebase, and a sense of humor that had kept Sarah sane through 3 deployments worth of bad food, worse living conditions, and the kind of boredom that made combat almost a relief. Elena had been Sarah's FET partner, her best friend, her sister in every way that mattered. They'd walked 180 patrols together, sat with Afghan women in compounds that smelled like tea and fear, gathered intelligence that some analyst in Tampa would turn into target packages for JSOC operators who never knew where the information came from. Elena had died on Patrol 181, March 14th, 2016, Nawa District, an IED buried in a goat path that no one had bothered to check because everyone was tired, and it was the end of a long day, and they'd walked that path 50 times before without incident. Except that was how it always happened. The 51st time. The blast had taken Elena's legs below the knees. Sarah had held her in a ditch for 47 minutes while they waited for the medevac bird. Held her while she bled, while she trembled, while her eyes stayed focused on Sarah's face like it was the last thing she wanted to see. Elena's last words were burned into Sarah's memory with a soldering iron. "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." She'd been scared. Sarah knew because she'd felt the trembling, but she'd told Elena's mother exactly what Elena had asked her to say. At the funeral, at Arlington National Cemetery, under a gray sky that felt appropriate because the world had lost something bright and nothing about that was okay. Sarah picked up the memorial bracelet from the nightstand, stainless steel, engraved with a name, a date, and a set of coordinates. C.P.L. Elena Hawk Martinez, USMC, March 14, 2016. She slid it onto her right wrist. It clicked against the bone. It always clicked against the bone. She'd been wearing it for 6 years, and the sound still landed somewhere deep in her chest. The same place every time. "Okay, Hawk," she said to the empty room. "One more." The phone call had come 3 days ago. Aegis Medical Solutions, a private military medical contracting firm that needed a trauma nurse for a joint special operations task force in East Africa. 12 months, hazard pay, forward operating base near the Djibouti-Somalia border, supporting counterterrorism operations against al-Shabaab. The recruiter had barely finished the sentence before Sarah said, yes. Most nurses wanted time to think about it, wanted to talk to their families, wanted to weigh the money against the risk. Sarah didn't have a family to consult. Her parents were dead. Her friends were scattered across the country trying to build civilian lives that Sarah couldn't even imagine wanting. The apartment in Phoenix was a place she slept, not a place she lived. The truth was she'd been ready to go back the moment she'd come home. Civilian life felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. Technically functional, but wrong in a way she felt with every step. The VA medical center where she worked was full of good people doing important work, but it moved too slowly. The paperwork took too long. The fluorescent lights were too bright. The patients called her sweetheart and meant it kindly, but it made her want to scream because she wasn't anybody's sweetheart. She was a Marine, a combat veteran, a woman who'd walked 180 patrols through the worst province in Afghanistan and come home with her hands steady and a dead best friend. She didn't fit here. She'd never fit here. So she packed the duffel bag, turned off the lights, locked the door, drove to the airport in a truck with 200,000 miles on it and an OIF veteran sticker she'd never bothered to peel off the bumper. She didn't look back. Forward operating base Keating, present day. Ghost was in the corner of the briefing room when Sarah Morgan arrived. Most people didn't notice him. He had that gift, the ability to be present without being seen. It came from 50 years of watching and listening and learning that the people who talked the least usually knew the most. Commander Rachel Stern was doing the briefing. Navy trauma surgeon, 44 years old, competent, experienced, and one of the few people on this FOB who'd actually read Sarah's full contractor file before she arrived. Stern knew about the Lioness program, about the 180 patrols, about the Bronze Star with Valor for carrying a wounded Marine 400 meters through an active ambush while taking fire from 3 directions. Stern had kept that information to herself, respected Sarah's choice to stay invisible. Ghost respected that too, but he also knew that secrets had a shelf life, and this particular secret was about to expire. Senior Chief Marcus Hale stood in the middle of the trauma bay like he owned it. 6'1", 210 pounds, built like a weapon and carrying himself with the coiled intensity of a man who'd kicked in a lot of doors and expected the next one to kick back. 14 years in the Navy, 11 as a SEAL. An operator who'd earned his trident the hard way and wore it like a shield against everything soft, in civilian, in contractor. Hale didn't trust contractors. He'd made that clear on day one, made it clearer every day since. "Let me be clear, Morgan," Hale said, his voice flat and final. "My operators come back hurt. They get treated by my corpsman, not by some contract nurse who got her trauma certification from a weekend seminar." Ghost watched Sarah's face. Watched the way she absorbed the hostility without reacting. Her hands stayed relaxed at her sides. Her eyes stayed focused on Hale's face without challenging, without submitting, just there, present, calm. "Your petty officer Navarro missed a tension pneumothorax on your last post-op patient," Sarah said. Her voice was so calm it barely registered as speech. "I caught it. Your operator is alive because I was here. You can dislike me, Senior Chief, but you can't argue with the vitals monitor." Hale stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked out. Ghost waited, counted to 30. Then he stood and followed Sarah as she walked toward the containerized housing units. Caught up to her between the HESCO barriers and the water buffaloes. "Staff Sergeant Morgan," he said quietly. She stopped, turned. Her face showed surprise for exactly half a second before she locked it down. "I'm not—" "You did the Lioness program." Not a question, a statement. "2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, Helmand Province, 3 deployments, female engagement team." Sarah's jaw tightened. "How did you—" Ghost held up a hand. "I can spot a Marine at 100 yards in a sandstorm. You corner check every time you move. You scan high and low. You keep your back to walls. You walk like someone who's been on point patrol. I'd appreciate it if you kept that to yourself, sir. Your secret's safe." Ghost paused. "But when the time comes, and it will, don't hesitate. Warriors recognize warriors." "Sir?" Ghost looked past her, toward the southern perimeter, toward the darkness where the threat reports said Al-Shabaab was watching, waiting, probing. "I spent 3 tours in Vietnam," he said. "Force recon. I've seen things go bad in every way they can go bad, and I've learned one thing that matters more than anything else." He looked back at Sarah, looked at her the way Captain Julia Henderson had looked at him in 1969, with eyes that saw past the uniform and the rank, and the things people pretended to be. Looked at her and saw what she actually was. "The best warriors are the ones nobody notices until the moment everyone needs them," Ghost said. "So keep doing what you're doing. Show up. Do your job. Let them underestimate you. But when the time comes, and I promise you it's coming, remember who you are. Remember what you've done. And don't you dare hesitate." Sarah didn't respond, just stood there with Elena's memorial bracelet catching the morning light, and her eyes searching Ghost's face, like she was trying to figure out if he was real or if she'd imagined this entire conversation. Ghost smiled, a smile with edges. "Semper Fi, Marine." He turned and walked away, left her standing there between the water buffaloes and the containerized housing units. Left her with the weight of being seen for the first time in 7 months, and the knowledge that someone knew. Someone who mattered. Someone who'd been exactly where she was 50 years ago. Someone who recognized a warrior when he saw one. The coffee at Forward Operating Base Keating tasted like someone had dissolved boot leather in battery acid and called it a beverage. Ghost had been drinking it for 6 weeks, and it still made him wince. But coffee was coffee, and at 68 years old, caffeine was one of the few things keeping him vertical. He sat across from Sarah in a corner of the Tactical Operations Center that nobody used because the air conditioning vent dripped, and the folding chair had a wobble that made you seasick if you sat there long enough. Perfect for private conversations that couldn't happen in public. "Senior Chief Hale lost a man 2 years ago," Ghost said. "PO2 Torres, 23 years old. Gunshot wound to the femoral artery. Forward aid station in Kandahar." Sarah listened. Didn't interrupt. Ghost appreciated that. Most people felt the need to fill silence with words. Sarah knew better. "Contract medic on site froze," Ghost continued, just stood there while Torres bled out on the floor. 47 seconds. Hale timed it. 47 seconds of watching a kid die while someone who was supposed to know what they were doing did absolutely nothing. Ghost paused, took a sip of terrible coffee, let the next words settle in his chest before he spoke them out loud. That contract medic was my nephew, James Reeves, Jr., named after me, 26 years old, good kid, smart, but he'd never been under fire before, never had to work with rounds snapping overhead and people screaming. He froze, and a good man died because of it. Sarah's eyes widened, just slightly, just enough. Hale doesn't know that, Ghost said. I couldn't tell him. How do you tell a man who lost someone that the person responsible for that loss is related to you? That you're the one who encouraged him to take that contractor job because the money was good and it would look great on his resume. That's not your fault, sir. Isn't it? Ghost set down the coffee cup. I spent 50 years in this world. I should have known better. Should have told him that combat medical work isn't something you learn from a textbook. It's something you learn by doing, in the worst possible circumstances, with lives on the line. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her. You're not him, Ghost said, and Hale needs to learn the difference between incompetence and experience, between someone who's never been tested and someone who's been tested 180 times and passed every single one. Sarah touched the bracelet on her wrist. He doesn't trust me because I'm a contractor, not because I'm incompetent. He doesn't trust you because you remind him of his worst day. And until he sees you on your best day, that's not going to change. Ghost stood. His knees protested. He ignored them. So give him that day, Marine. Show him what a real trauma professional looks like under fire. Show him the difference between someone who talks about it and someone who's lived it. And if that day doesn't come, Ghost looked toward the southern perimeter, toward the darkness, toward the threat that every instinct he'd honed over 5 decades was telling him was coming. It's coming, he said quietly. Trust me, it's coming. That night, Sarah returned to the trauma bay for her usual midnight shift. She was restocking supplies when she heard footsteps. Baptiste appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything, just walked to the supply cabinet, opened the bottom drawer, and placed something inside. An M9 sidearm, magazine inserted, safety on. Their eyes met. Baptiste's expression was unreadable, but Sarah understood. One Marine to another. Preparation that didn't need explanation. Thank you, Staff Sergeant, she said quietly. Baptiste nodded once. When it comes, don't hesitate. He walked out, left the drawer slightly open, left Sarah standing there with the weight of recognition settling in her chest. Someone else knew. Someone else was preparing. And that meant Ghost wasn't the only one who saw the storm coming. 3 nights before the attack, Sarah found Jake Rivers in the trauma bay at 0200, staring at a hemostatic gauze packet like it contained the secrets of the universe. Can't sleep? She asked. Jake jumped, dropped the packet. Sorry, I keep thinking about that pneumothorax case, the one Senior Chief mentioned. If I'd been on duty instead of Navarro, would I have caught it? Sarah picked up the gauze packet, held it up. Show me how you'd pack a femoral artery wound. Now? You're awake. I'm awake. Might as well be productive. For the next hour, she walked him through it. Not lecturing, teaching. The difference between pressure that stops bleeding and pressure that damages tissue. How to read a patient's color before the monitors caught up. The sound of tension pneumothorax versus simple pneumothorax. One wheezed, the other didn't. Miss it, someone died. You're leaving the gauze on the wrong shelf again, Sarah said, her Arizona drawl stretching the vowels. Jake scrambled to fix it. Sorry, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am. I work for a living. The phrase came out before she could stop it. Old enlisted joke. Jake gave her a funny look. She changed the subject. But Ghost, watching from the darkened TOC across the compound, saw the whole thing. Saw the way Sarah taught, patient, thorough, the way someone taught when they'd been taught well themselves. The way Elena Martinez had taught Sarah 6 years ago in a trauma bay in Helmand Province. The chain continuing, one link at a time. The intelligence reports were getting worse. Ghost read them every morning in the Tactical Operations Center, sat in the back corner with his reading glasses and a cup of terrible coffee, and absorbed information the way a sponge absorbed water. Patterns, trends, things that looked random until you stepped back far enough to see the shape they made. Increased surveillance activity around the FOB. Unusual foot traffic in the wadis, the dry riverbeds that snaked through the scrubland and provided concealment for anyone who wanted to approach unseen. Contact reports from patrols. Nothing significant, nothing concrete, just activity. Activity that preceded something bad. Ghost had seen this before. Quezon, 1968. 3 days before the siege started, there'd been this same pattern. Increased reconnaissance, probing attacks, testing response times, mapping weaknesses. He'd been a private then, terrified, certain he was going to die. Now he was a colonel, retired, working as a security consultant because sitting at home in North Carolina watching game shows made him want to eat his sidearm. And he wasn't terrified anymore, just aware. Aware the way you got when you'd survived enough bad situations to know what they look like in advance. Commander Stern found him in the TOC at 0430. She looked tired. Everyone looked tired. That was the baseline state at a forward operating base. Tired and wired and waiting for something to happen. "You're reading the intel briefs again," Stern said. "Someone should." "The assessment says low to moderate threat." Ghost looked up, took off his reading glasses. "The assessment is wrong." Stern sat down, ignored the wobbling chair. "Why?" "Because I've seen this pattern before. Quezon, 68. 3 days before they hit us, we got this exact same activity. Recon, probes, testing. And some intelligence analyst in Saigon wrote up a report that said, low to moderate threat, because the numbers looked manageable on paper. And they hit us with 30,000 NVA regulars. 77 days of siege. We lost 274 Marines. Could have been a lot worse if we hadn't gotten lucky." Stern was quiet for a moment. Then, "You think they're coming?" "I know they're coming. Question is, when? And whether we're ready." Ghost looked across the compound, toward the trauma bay, toward the woman inside it who was probably staging supplies and running through procedures and doing all the things that good medical professionals did when they sensed a storm coming. "Some of us are more ready than others," he said quietly. Stern followed his gaze. "You told her." "Told her what?" "That you know who she is." Ghost smiled. "She earned the right to be recognized. And when this place goes hot, and it will, I want her to know that at least one person on this FOB understands exactly what she's capable of. Hale's not going to like it. Hale's going to learn something valuable. The same lesson I learned in 1969. Ghost stood, stretched, felt every one of his 68 years in his lower back. That warriors come in forms you don't expect. And if you're smart, you learn to recognize them before you need them. He walked toward the door, stopped, looked back at Stern. "Get the trauma base staged for mass casualty. Extra blood products, extra hemostatic agents, and make sure Morgan runs combat trauma drills with the corpsmen, especially the young one, Rivers. He's got good hands, but he's never worked under fire." "You're that certain?" "I'm that certain." Ghost walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. The stars were fading. The eastern horizon was going gray. In 6 hours, the temperature would hit 115 degrees, and everyone would move slowly and complain about the heat. But right now, it was cool, almost pleasant. A morning that made you remember why you joined the military in the first place. The clarity, the purpose, The sense that you were part of something bigger than yourself. Ghost walked to the southern perimeter, stood at the wire and looked out into the scrubland. Somewhere out there, men were watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. He touched the sidearm on his hip, the M1911 he'd carried at Quezon, the one that had saved his life 3 times and killed 11 enemy combatants and earned a place in his will because it was going to outlive him. "Come on then," he said to the darkness. "Let's see what you've got." The darkness didn't answer, but Ghost knew it was listening. And soon, very soon, it was going to respond. The vehicle-borne improvised explosive device detonated against the south wall of Forward Operating Base Keating at 0347 on a Tuesday morning. The sound wasn't a sound. It was a physical thing, a wall of pressure that hit the chest and squeezed the air out of lungs and made the brain go white for one terrible second where nothing existed except the blast. Sarah Morgan was reviewing a patient chart when it happened. One moment she was standing at the trauma bay counter with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. The next moment, the world was ending. But she didn't flinch. The lights died. Emergency generators kicked in 2 seconds later, bathing everything in red. Dust filled the air. The ISO container walls shook. Somewhere outside, the base alarm started screaming. Sarah set down the coffee cup, slowly, deliberately, like she had all the time in the world. Then she moved. There was no hesitation, no transition, no visible shift between the calm contract nurse reviewing charts and the combat veteran whose body remembered 180 patrols through Helmand Province. Her posture changed. Her eyes went flat and focused. Her hands moved with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this before, in worse places. "Jake!" Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Triage protocol, now! Move the post-op patient behind the supply crate. He's ambulatory. Walk him there. Go." Petty Officer Second Class Jake Rivers was 22 years old, and this was his first deployment and his first time hearing an explosion that close. His face had gone pale. His hands were shaking. His eyes were too wide. But Sarah's voice left no room for panic. It was a voice that assumed competence and expected obedience and made the impossible seem manageable through sheer force of will. Jake moved. Outside, the world was chaos. Automatic weapons fire ripped through the darkness, AK-47s. The distinctive clatter of Kalashnikov actions that every American service member learned to recognize by sound alone. The base alarm kept screaming. People were shouting. Someone was firing back with an M240 machine gun. The deep, steady boom, boom, boom of a belt-fed weapon that Jake could feel in his teeth. Sarah was transforming the trauma bay into a fortress. She shoved equipment behind reinforced supply crates, contained the drug cart as cover for the operating suite entrance where Commander Stern was already scrubbing in, pulled open the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet and took out the M9 sidearm that Staff Sergeant Baptiste had placed there 3 weeks ago without comment. She checked the magazine, racked the slide, set it on the counter within arm's reach. She did all of this in 45 seconds. Then the wounded started coming. The first SEAL stumbled through the door, half carried by another operator who was shouting something about the south wall being gone. The whole south wall. Fragments of the HESCO barriers had turned into high-velocity projectiles, and this operator had caught 3 of them. Face, arms, chest, bleeding from a dozen places at once. "Set him here," Sarah said, pointing to the first trauma bed. "Jake, primary survey, march protocol. Start with massive hemorrhage. I see arterial on the left arm, tourniquet above the wound. You know this. Go." Jake's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the tourniquet. He looked at the blood pooling on the floor. His mind went white, blank, empty of everything except terror. "Jake," Sarah's voice dropped lower. Not louder, lower. A low that went under the panic and found the part of him that still worked. "Look at me, not the blood, at me." He looked at her. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were already working on a second operator who'd come through the door with a penetrating abdominal wound. "You know this," she said. "We practice this. Clamp, pack, hold. Do it now." His hands stopped shaking. He clamped. He packed. He held. The gunfire was getting closer. Two more operators came through the door. One was walking. The other was being dragged by Chief Petty Officer Thomas Kane, and Kane was limping badly, his left thigh dark and wet with blood. Through and through gunshot wound. He'd been hit outside the Tactical Operations Center and had still managed to carry his wounded teammate 40 meters to the medical facility. Sarah made a calculation that took less than a second. "Jake, take Kane. Tourniquet high and tight on the left thigh. He's going to tell you he's fine. It's not fine. Ignore everything he says and stop the bleeding." "I'm fine," Kane grunted from the floor. "See?" Sarah was already turning to the next patient. "Ignore him." Then the doorway filled with a different kind of presence. Staff Sergeant Omar Baptiste stood there in full kit. Body armor, helmet, rifle. His face was streaked with dust and sweat. His eyes were the eyes of a man who'd been in combat before and recognized the geometry of what was happening. "Morgan," he said, 8 to 12 dismounts breaching the south side. They're heading for the medical facility." The words hung in the air. The medical facility was the softest target on the FOB, a building full of wounded people and medical staff, not hardened operators. If the attackers reached it, everyone inside was dead. Baptiste unslung the M4 from his back and held it out to her. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was recognition. One Marine to another. Recognition that didn't require words. Sarah caught the rifle one-handed, conducted a functions check, tap rack assess, under 2 seconds. The muscle memory of 180 combat patrols. Her hands moved with a fluency that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with a decade spent learning how to fight and bleed and survive in the worst places on earth. Jake was staring at her. His tourniquet was in place. Kane's bleeding was controlled, but his eyes were on Sarah and the rifle, and his face was the face of someone watching a stranger step out of a person they thought they knew. "Stay with the patients," Sarah told him. Her voice had changed, not the calm nurse voice, something older, harder, the voice of a staff sergeant who'd given orders under fire and expected them to be followed. "No matter what you hear outside, you stay. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Then a new voice spoke from the darkness beyond the doorway. Old, steady, carrying the weight of authority that came from 50 years of telling people what to do and having them do it. "She's going to need more than that, Staff Sergeant." Colonel James Ghost Reeves stepped into the red emergency lighting. He was in full kit too, but his was different, older, load-bearing vest they'd used in the first Gulf War. And in his hand was a pistol that Jake had only seen in museums, an M1911, Vietnam era, the blued steel worn smooth in places from decades of handling. Ghost held it out to Sarah. "I carried this at Khe Sanh. Time it went back to work." Sarah took it. The weight was different from the M9, heavier, more substantial, like holding a piece of history. "You knew," she said quietly. "I've known since the first day you walked onto this FOB corner, checking like you were on point patrol." Ghost's eyes were calm, almost gentle. "The question was never whether you could fight, Marine. The question was whether anyone else would be smart enough to let you." He turned to Baptiste. "You and Morgan establish a defensive position at the trauma bay entrance, 15 meters south. Sandbag position behind the generator. I'll coordinate from here." "Colonel, you should." "I'm 68 years old, and I've got 2 Purple Hearts from running toward gunfire when smarter men ran away. I'll be exactly where I need to be." Ghost's voice carried finality that ended arguments before they started. "Now move." Sarah moved. She went out the door with Baptiste into the darkness and the gunfire and the chaos. Behind her, Jake Rivers stood in the trauma bay with his hands covered in Kane's blood, watching the contract nurse disappear into a firefight with a rifle in her hands and the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. And he realized with a clarity that made his stomach clench that he'd never known her at all. The attack had been planned for weeks. The Al-Shabaab splinter cell had surveilled the FOB, mapped the guard rotations, identified the softest targets. They'd packed the vehicle-borne IED with enough explosives to take down the south wall and create a breach point. Then they'd sent 8 dismounted fighters through that breach with one objective: kill Americans. Film it, upload it, turn it into propaganda that would play on jihadi websites for the next decade. What they hadn't expected was a defensive position that met them with disciplined rifle fire from people who knew what they were doing. Sarah and Baptiste moved like they'd been doing this together for years instead of minutes. Fire and maneuver, the foundational tactic of Marine infantry combat. One person shoots, the other moves. Leapfrog forward or backward, depending on whether you're assaulting or defending. Maintain sectors of fire. Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count. Sarah established a position behind the sandbags near the generator. Prone. Rifle rested on the bags. Breathing controlled. The M1911 tucked into her waistband where she could reach it if things went bad up close. The attackers were moving through the breach. Dark shapes against darker night, moving fast but not tactically, bunched up, not maintaining spacing, mistakes that people made when they trained for ambushes, but not for assaulting a hardened position. "Contact," Sarah called out. Her voice was calm, professional. 2 o'clock, 75 meters, 2 dismounts behind the HESCO fragment. Baptiste shifted fire without hesitation. The M4 barked twice, controlled pairs. 2 rounds, reassess, 2 rounds. Disciplined shooting that came from training and experience and the knowledge that ammunition was finite and every bullet had to matter. One of the dismounts went down, the other dove for cover. Sarah was already tracking movement on the left side. 3 o'clock, 50 meters, single dismount, moving east behind the water buffalo. Her rifle came up. Sight picture, breath control, trigger press, the fundamentals that every Marine learned in boot camp and refined over years of practice until they became instinct. The dismount dropped. Inside the trauma bay, Ghost was on the tactical radio, coordinating. His voice was steady, measured, the voice of a man who'd done this before when radios were heavier and the stakes were just as high. "All stations, this is base. Multiple dismounts breaching south perimeter. Medical facility is under direct assault. Need fire suppression and QRF immediate." He pressed his hand to his chest briefly. A flicker of pain crossed his face. Gone in a second. Back to work. The Tactical Operations Center responded, then the SEAL element on the west side, then the guard towers. The defensive plan was coming together. Sectors of fire were being established. The FOB was transitioning from surprised to organized, but the attackers were still coming. Sarah fell back to the trauma bay entrance, not retreating, transitioning, because inside a SEAL operator was dying. His name was Petty Officer Rodriguez, 26 years old, shrapnel to the throat from the initial blast. His airway was compromised. He was making a wet, sucking sound that meant blood in the trachea and not much time before his brain ran out of oxygen. Sarah set down the rifle, pulled on gloves, grabbed a cricothyrotomy kit from the pre-staged supplies that she'd set up 3 days ago when Ghost had confirmed her suspicions that something bad was coming. "Jake, hold his head steady. Don't let him move. He's not breathing. He's breathing enough, for now. In 30 seconds, he won't be, so hold him steady and let me work." The procedure was simple in theory. Cut through the skin, find the cricothyroid membrane, make an incision, insert a tube, secure it, connect to oxygen. Simple. Except Sarah was doing it by headlamp while rounds impacted the ISO container wall 2 feet above her head. The metallic ping of bullets hitting steel. A sound that made everyone who'd ever been under fire want to make themselves smaller. Sarah didn't flinch. Her hands were steady, surgeon steady. Steady that came from doing this before in worse places. She'd last performed this procedure in Helmand Province, in the dark, on her knees, with Elena Martinez holding a flashlight and Taliban fighters 40 meters away. Her hands remembered. The tube went in. Rodriguez's chest expanded. Color returned to his face. Not good color, but better than blue. Jake, maintain airway. Don't let that tube move. You're doing great. Then she picked up the rifle and went back to the door. Ghost was standing at the trauma bay entrance now. Not fighting, too old for that, but coordinating, directing, using his radio and his experience and his 50 years of accumulated knowledge to turn chaos into something manageable. Sarah, he said quietly, not Morgan, not Marine, Sarah. They're pushing hard on the south approach. QRF is 5 minutes out. We need to hold until then. We'll hold. I know you will. Ghost's hand went to his chest, pressed there hard. His face paled. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. Sir? Sarah's voice sharpened. You hit? I'm fine. But his voice was tight, strained. Go. I've got things here. Sarah hesitated. 1 second. Saw the blood seeping through his vest at the shoulder. Saw him trying to hide it. Colonel, that's an order, Marine. Go. Sarah went. The next 15 minutes were violence. Pure, distilled violence that didn't translate well to after-action reports because it happened too fast and too close and with too much at stake to remember the details. Just fragments, impressions, the smell of cordite and blood and dust. The sound of automatic weapons fire and people shouting and helicopter rotors in the distance getting closer. Sarah fought like a Marine, not like someone pretending, like someone who'd done this 180 times and survived because she was good at it. She worked with Baptiste, moving, shooting, communicating, coordination that looked choreographed, but was actually just two professionals doing their jobs. She fell back twice more to treat casualties. Once for Kane's gunshot wound, packing it properly with hemostatic gauze and pressure bandages. Once for an arterial bleed on the shrapnel patient that Jake was struggling with. Keep pressure here, she told Jake, positioning his hands. Don't let go for anything. You hear that shooting? It doesn't exist. This wound exists. You and this wound. That's your whole universe right now. Then back to the door, back to the rifle, back to the fight. On the west side of the compound, Senior Chief Marcus Hale was having the strangest experience of his professional life. He was coordinating his SEAL Elements response to the breach, directing fire, managing sectors, doing everything a platoon leader was supposed to do during a complex attack. And he was listening to the tactical radio net with a growing sense of unreality that made him question whether he'd been hit in the head without noticing. Because the voice on the radio, the female voice calling contact reports and coordinating fire with professional precision, sounded nothing like a contract nurse. It sounded like someone who'd done this before. A lot. In places that made East Africa look like a vacation. Unknown station this net, Hale transmitted. Identify yourself. Baptiste's voice came back. Unknown station, identify yourself. Then the female voice again. And this time Hale heard something in it that made his chest tighten. Authority, confidence. The tone of someone who expected to be listened to and had earned that expectation through experience. But before she could respond, another voice cut in. Older, male, carrying weight. All stations, this is Colonel Reeves. Hale's hand tightened on the radio. Ghost, the security consultant. The retired Force Recon Marine who moved like he was still 20 and had eyes that saw everything. The voice you're hearing is Staff Sergeant Sarah Morgan, United States Marine Corps, formerly attached 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. She has 3 urgent surgical and 1 expectant at roll 2. She's been coordinating medical facility defense for the past 20 minutes, and she's about to save all your asses. 3 seconds of silence on the net. Silence that fell when every operator listening had to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Then Ghost again, his voice quieter now, but carrying across the frequency with the weight of authority and experience and 50 years of earned respect. Semper Fi, Staff Sergeant. Keep those boys alive until the birds get here. And Sarah's voice just as quiet, just as certain. Aye, sir. In the Tactical Operations Center, a communications operator looked at his chief. Who the hell is she? Hale stood frozen, his hands still on the radio, his mind racing through fragments that suddenly clicked together like puzzle pieces he'd been staring at for 7 months without seeing the picture. Staff Sergeant, Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, Helmand Province, 2014. The intel package for Hammerfall had come from a FET team, Female Engagement Team. He remembered the briefing, 6 women, sitting with Afghan women in compounds, gathering information piece by piece over 6 months, building trust, earning secrets. The compound layout had been perfect, guard rotations exact, weapon cache locations precise, intelligence that only came from human sources, from people who'd been inside, who'd seen it with their own eyes. And the operation had nearly cost him 3 men because the Taliban had been more heavily armed than expected. Because intelligence was never perfect. Because people died in the gaps between what you knew and what you thought you knew. He'd earned his Silver Star that night, standing in a compound outside Nawa-e-Baraksai, returning fire, dragging wounded operators to cover, holding position until the QRF arrived. And somewhere, in some village he'd never seen, Sarah Morgan had been drinking tea with a woman who'd told her where the weapons were hidden, had been building the trust that made that mission possible. The contract nurse, the woman he'd told didn't belong, the woman who'd been in more firefights than half his platoon combined. Hale's jaw clenched, his hands formed fists. Not anger, shame. The particular burning shame of realizing you'd been wrong in a way that couldn't be taken back. Senior Chief? The communications operator was staring at him. You okay? Hale forced himself to breathe, to focus, to push it down because there was still a firefight happening and his men needed him. I'm fine, he said. His voice came out steady, professional, the voice of a SEAL platoon leader who had his shit together. But inside, something had cracked, something that wouldn't be fixed with an apology or a conversation or anything except time and the hard work of changing how he saw the world. The MH-60M Blackhawks came in low and fast 12 minutes later, door gunners lighting up the south approach with minigun fire. The distinctive sound of 6,000 rounds per minute tearing through the darkness and turning the breach point into a kill zone. Behind them, a ground element from Camp Lemonnier, Navy SEALs and Marine Raiders, and Air Force combat controllers. The quick reaction force that every forward operating base kept on standby for exactly this situation. The firefight ended the way all firefights ended, abruptly, with a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise it replaced. Sarah set down the M4, picked up a suture kit, pulled on fresh gloves, went back to being a nurse as if the last 45 minutes had been a dream someone else had. But her hands were shaking now, just slightly, just enough to notice if you were looking. The adrenaline draining away, the cost of keeping it together while rounds snapped overhead and people bled, and every decision mattered because lives hung in the balance. Jake Rivers stood in the corner with a tourniquet still in his hand and blood on his scrubs and stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Because he was. Ghost appeared in the trauma bay entrance, moving slower now, his face pale under the dust, his hand pressed to his chest again, harder this time. Colonel? Sarah's voice shifted. Not combat voice, medical voice. "Sir, are you hurt?" "I'm fine, just—" Ghost stumbled, caught himself against the doorframe. "Just old." Then he collapsed. It happened fast. One moment he was standing, the next he was on the floor with Sarah dropping beside him and her hands moving with professional speed. Checking pulse, checking breathing, opening his vest. Blood. Not a lot, but enough. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder. Through and through. He'd taken a round sometime during the fight and hadn't said anything because there were more important things to worry about. Like keeping the young Marine at the door alive. Like coordinating defense. Like making sure that when Sarah revealed herself, it was in the right way with the right words from someone who carried enough weight to make it matter. "Jake!" Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. "Trauma Bay 1, now!" "I need hemostatic gauze, pressure bandages, and 2 units O-positive typed and crossed for Colonel Reeves. He's hurt and he's 68 years old, and he just pushed himself way too hard. Move." Jake moved. Sarah worked. Hands steady again now that she had a job to do. Packing the wound, controlling bleeding, starting an IV line, doing all the things she'd been doing for 6 months as the contract nurse that nobody trusted. Except now everyone was watching. Came from his bed with a tourniquet on his thigh. The SEAL operators who'd started arriving for treatment. Commander Stern from the operating suite entrance. And Ghost looking up at her with eyes that were tired but satisfied. Like he'd accomplished something important and the cost had been worth it. "You did good, Marine," he said quietly. "Real good. Save your breath, sir. You're going to need it when I'm done yelling at you for not reporting that GSW immediately." Ghost almost smiled. "That's the Sarah Morgan I knew was in there." Then his eyes closed. Not unconscious, just tired. Letting someone else carry the weight for a while. Sarah worked, stabilized him, prepped him for medevac, called for the helicopter that would take him to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, where surgeons with better equipment and more time could make sure that a 68-year-old colonel who'd pushed himself too hard would live to push himself too hard again. And while she worked, Senior Chief Marcus Hale walked into the trauma bay, stood in the entrance, looked at Sarah with her hands covered in ghost blood, and the M1911 still tucked in her waistband, and the expression on her face that said she was done hiding. Their eyes met. Hale opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Staff Sergeant," he said finally. Just that, just her rank. The first time he'd used it. Sarah nodded once, kept working, kept her hands on Ghost while the old warrior, who'd recognized her when nobody else would, breathed steady and calm under her care. And outside, the stars over forward operating base Keating burned bright and fierce and uncaring, while the base alarm finally went silent and the smoke from the south wall breach drifted east on a wind that smelled like cordite and dust and the sharp metallic tang of blood. The war continued the way it always did, but something had changed. Something fundamental, something that couldn't be taken back. Sarah Morgan had stopped being invisible, and that changed everything. The after-action review took place 14 hours later in the Tactical Operations Center. Every operator, support staff member, and medical personnel on forward operating base Keating was present. The room smelled like sweat and coffee, and the particular exhaustion that came from surviving something terrible and having to relive it in bureaucratic detail. Senior Chief Marcus Hale sat in the back row. He'd been one of the first SEAL operators to respond to the breach and had spent the entire engagement on the west side of the compound, unaware of what was happening at the medical facility until Ghost's radio call had cut through the tactical net like a knife through silk. He hadn't said a word since, just sat there with his jaw tight and his hands resting on his knees and his eyes focused on the front of the room where Commander Rachel Stern stood in surgical scrubs that still had blood on them. Sarah sat in the second row, clean scrubs now, hair pulled back. Elena's memorial bracelet on her right wrist catching the fluorescent light. Her face was as blank as it always was. the careful civilian mask she'd worn for 7 months. But something had shifted behind her eyes, something that said hiding was over, and whatever came next would have to be faced head-on. Commander Stern opened a file, Sarah's full contractor personnel file, the one that Aegis Medical Solutions had provided and that Stern had read on day one and kept to herself ever since out of respect for Sarah's choice to remain invisible. That choice was about to become irrelevant. Before we begin the tactical debrief, Stern said, I need to address something that affects our understanding of last night's defensive action. The room went quiet. Not the polite silence of people waiting for a briefing to start, the weighted silence of people sensing that something significant was about to be said. Our contract trauma nurse, Sarah Morgan, coordinated the defense of the medical facility during the attack. She treated 4 combat casualties under fire. She performed a field cricothyrotomy during active engagement. She coached our junior corpsman through his first combat trauma sequence. Stern paused, let the next words settle before she spoke them. She did this while simultaneously engaging enemy combatants with rifle fire alongside Staff Sergeant Baptiste. The silence deepened. Jake Rivers, sitting in the 3rd row with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, felt his chest tighten. He'd seen it, watched it happen through the trauma bay window, but hearing it described in official language made it real in a way that witnessing it hadn't. Stern continued, Miss Morgan is a former United States Marine Corps Staff Sergeant, Infantry, 0311 Rifleman. She was a pioneer of the Lioness program, one of the first women attached to infantry combat patrols in Afghanistan. Every face in the room turned toward Sarah. She didn't move, didn't react, just sat there with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward like she was listening to a weather report. She conducted over 180 combat patrols with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in Helmand Province over 3 deployments. She participated in 23 direct fire engagements. She earned a Bronze Star with Valor for carrying a wounded Marine 400 meters through an active ambush while taking fire from 3 directions. Hale's hands on his knees had gone very still. His jaw tightened in a way that only people who knew him well would have noticed. And in this room, everyone knew him well. She subsequently served with the Female Engagement Team program, village stability operations and intelligence gathering during her 3rd Helmand deployment. Her intelligence work provided target packages for multiple joint special operations missions in the region. The air in the room felt too thick to breathe. Sarah kept her eyes forward, kept her face neutral, but her right hand moved almost unconsciously to touch the bracelet on her wrist. Elena's bracelet, the reminder of why she did this, why any of it mattered. Stern looked directly at Hale, including Operation Hammerfall. The name hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Hale's face went pale, not dramatically, just a slight draining of color that someone might miss if they weren't watching carefully. But Sarah was watching, and she saw the exact moment when understanding hit him like a physical blow. Operation Hammerfall, September 2014, a nighttime raid on a Taliban weapons cache in a compound outside Nawa-e-Baraksai. Hale had led the assault element. The compound had been exactly where the intelligence said it would be. The defenses had been exactly as predicted. The layout, the guard rotations, the escape routes, all of it mapped with a precision that Hale had attributed to signals intelligence and drone surveillance. He'd never asked where the original human intelligence had come from. Operators didn't ask about the quiet work that made their loud work possible. It was the nature of the machine. The people who kicked down doors and the people who told them which doors to kick existed in parallel universes that rarely intersected. But now those universes were colliding. 3 of Hale's operators had nearly died that night. The Taliban fighters had been more heavily armed than expected, and the firefight had lasted 45 minutes. Hale had dragged one of his wounded men to cover, returned fire, called in the quick reaction force, and held the position until air support arrived. He'd earned his silver star for that night, earned his promotion, earned everything that had made him Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hale, SEAL platoon leader, the man who kicked down doors and brought his boys home. All of it built on intelligence that Sarah Morgan had gathered while walking through Afghan villages in body armor, sitting cross-legged on dirt floors, drinking tea with terrified women, earning their trust one cup, one smile, one promise at a time. 6 months of patient, invisible, dangerous work. Work that nobody filmed and nobody celebrated and nobody remembered unless you were the woman who'd done it. Hale had built his legend on her groundwork, and he'd spent 7 months calling her the contract nurse. The weight of that realization showed on his face for exactly 3 seconds before he locked it down behind the professional mask that operators learned to wear when their world was falling apart and they still had to function. Stern closed the file. Colonel Reeves asked me to read that into the record. He's currently at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, recovering from a gunshot wound he sustained during the defense. He's expected to make a full recovery. She looked around the room. Colonel Reeves also asked me to convey his assessment that Staff Sergeant Morgan is one of the finest Marines he's ever served beside. And he's served beside a lot of Marines over 50 years. The briefing continued. Casualty counts, ammunition expenditure, damage assessment, the tactical minutia that turned chaos into bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. But nobody was really listening anymore. They were all processing, recalibrating, trying to reconcile the contract nurse who ate alone and kept her head down with the combat veteran who'd coordinated a defense and saved lives and fought like someone who'd done it 180 times before. Because she had. When the briefing ended, Sarah stood up and walked back to the trauma bay to check on her patients. She didn't add to Stern's account, didn't correct or embellish, didn't stick around to answer questions or accept congratulations or deal with whatever came next. She just went back to work, the way she always did. Jake caught her outside between the Hesco barriers and the water buffaloes, the same spot where Ghost had found her 7 weeks ago, and told her that warriors recognize warriors. Staff Sergeant, his voice cracked slightly. I mean, Sarah, Jake. She stopped walking, turned to face him, really looked at him the way she had during the firefight when his hands were shaking, and she told him to look at her instead of the blood. Why didn't you tell us? It was a fair question. Sarah had known it was coming from the moment Ghost had keyed that radio and spoken her rank out loud for everyone to hear. Because you needed to trust the nurse, she said quietly. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the bronze star. You needed to trust the person who showed up every shift and taught you where to put the hemostatic gauze. Jake's eyes were too bright. But you were... I was a Marine. I'm still a Marine. That doesn't change based on what I'm wearing or what people choose to see. She paused. You did good last night, Jake. You locked in when it mattered. You didn't freeze. You trusted your training and you kept people alive. Because you taught me, because you learned. There's a difference. Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was brief, almost awkward, like she wasn't used to offering comfort. Elena, Hawk, she would have liked you. You've got the same things she had. Good hands and a good heart. That combination is rare. Don't waste it. Who was Hawk? Sarah touched the bracelet on her wrist. The metal was warm from her skin. Someone who taught me that the most important thing we can do isn't the procedure. It's the presence, being there, hands on the patient, voice in their ear, making sure they know they're not alone. She looked at Jake, at this 22-year-old kid who'd survived his first firefight and come through it with his humanity intact. She taught me that, and then she was gone, and I was kneeling in dirt wishing someone would tell me I wasn't alone. Sarah's voice stayed steady, but something in her eyes shifted. So I'm telling you now, you're not alone. You're part of something, and that matters. Jake nodded, couldn't speak, just nodded and watched as Sarah walked back to the trauma bay to check on patients who needed her more than he did right now. And he understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. That the strongest people were often the ones who carried the most weight, and they did it quietly, without complaint, without expecting recognition. They just showed up, did the work, and passed it on to the next person who needed it. Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Germany. 72 hours after the attack. The hospital room was clean and white and smelled like disinfectant, and the particular sadness that all hospitals carried, regardless of how good their care was. Ghost lay in a bed that was too narrow and too short for his frame, his left shoulder wrapped in bandages, his face pale but alert. Sarah sat in the chair beside the bed. She'd rotated off the FOB on the same medevac flight that had carried Ghost to Germany. Commander Stern had insisted, said Sarah needed a break after coordinating a 45-minute defense and treating casualties under fire, and dealing with the aftermath of having her cover blown in the most dramatic way possible. Sarah had wanted to argue, had wanted to stay at the FOB and keep working because work was what she knew, and sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering hurt. But Ghost had asked for her specifically, and you didn't say no when a 68-year-old colonel who'd taken a round for you asked for something. You didn't have to expose me, Sarah said quietly. It was the first thing she'd said since arriving 20 minutes ago. The first thing that mattered. Ghost looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, and understood too much, and carried too much wisdom to pretend otherwise. Yes, I did, he said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia, but steady underneath. You were hiding your light, and I spent 50 years watching warriors get overlooked because they didn't fit the mold people expected. I didn't need... You needed exactly what I gave you. Validation from someone who carries weight. Ghost shifted in the bed, winced, settled. That corpsman in Vietnam, the one who saved me in Quang Tri, Captain Julia Henderson. She treated 63 wounded Marines in 3 tours, earned a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts, carried more wounded men to safety than most infantry officers I knew. He paused. Let the next words carry the weight they deserved. Nobody remembers her. You know why? Because she didn't shout about it, didn't make a fuss, just did her job, and went home and died in 2003 in a car accident in Virginia, and got buried with full honors that maybe 20 people attended. Sarah's hand moved to her bracelet, to Elena's name engraved in steel. I promised myself something at her funeral, Ghost said. Promised that if I ever met another warrior like her, I wouldn't let them disappear into history, unnamed and unrecognized. His eyes locked on Sarah's. You're her legacy, Elena's legacy, my legacy, the line of people who show up and do the work and carry the weight without expecting anything in return. I don't know how to be visible, Sarah said. Her voice cracked slightly, just enough to hear. You don't have to be loud. You just have to be present. Ghost reached out with his good hand, picked up something from the bedside table. This belongs to you now. It was a medal, Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in the United States. Ghost's Navy Cross, earned at Khe Sanh in 1968 for actions that had saved 12 Marines and held a position for 6 hours against overwhelming odds. Sir, I can't. It's not mine to keep, never was. Ghost pressed it into her hand. His palm was warm, calloused. The hand of a man who'd spent decades carrying rifles and wounded friends, and the weight of decisions that meant life or death. This belongs to every warrior who came after me, every person who looked at the fire and walked toward it anyway because someone needed them to. He closed Sarah's fingers around the medal. Julia Henderson gave me this without knowing it. Gave it to me by showing up in that jungle and refusing to let me die. Now I'm giving it to you. And someday, maybe 20 years from now, maybe longer, you'll find someone else who needs it more than you do. And you'll pass it on. Sarah stared at the medal. at the ribbon faded from decades of storage, at the bronze star in the center that caught the fluorescent light and held it. "There's something else," Ghost said. He pulled his good hand to his wrist, worked at something, removed a bracelet, bronze, worn smooth from handling, old enough that Sarah couldn't tell if it had been made yesterday or 50 years ago. Ghost handed it to her. Sarah turned it over, read the inscription. Captain Julia Henderson, USA, 1969. To the next one. POW bracelet, Ghost said quietly. People wore them during Vietnam. Each one had a name of a prisoner of war or missing in action. You wore it until they came home or until you knew they weren't coming home. He paused. Julia gave this to me the day I rotated back to the States. Said it wasn't for her. Said it was for the next warrior I met who needed to remember they weren't alone. Sarah couldn't speak, could barely breathe. "You're not alone, Sarah. You've never been alone. You're part of a chain that goes back further than either of us can trace. Warriors who show up, who do the work, who carry the weight. And every time you touch that bracelet, I want you to remember something." "What?" "That someone saw you. That someone recognized what you were. That someone thought you were worth fighting for, even when you didn't think you were worth fighting for yourself." Ghost settled back into the pillow. Exhausted. Exhausted that came from giving away everything you had because someone else needed it more. "Now get out of here and go back to that FOB and keep those boys alive. That's an order, Marine." Sarah stood, hesitated, then did something she almost never did. She came to attention, rendered a proper salute. The salute that a staff sergeant gives to a colonel when words aren't enough. Ghost returned it, his hands shaking slightly from pain and medication and 68 years of accumulated damage. But steady enough, always steady enough. "Semper Fi, Sarah." "Semper Fi, sir." She walked out, carried the Navy Cross and the POW bracelet and the weight of being seen by someone who mattered, someone who'd walked the same roads 50 years ago and survived long enough to pass the torch to the next person who needed it. Forward Operating Base Keating, 0300 hours, 5 days after the attack. The trauma bay was quiet, patients stable, base recovered, the south wall rebuilt with fresh HESCO barriers and additional defensive positions, and the particular heightened awareness that settled over a place that had just survived something terrible and knew it could happen again. Sarah was in her usual spot, usual hour, coffee going cold in her hand, Elena's bracelet on her right wrist, Baptiste's paracord bracelet on her left wrist in Marine Corps colors of scarlet and gold. And now, on the same wrist, Julia Henderson's POW bracelet warm against her skin. 3 bracelets, 3 reminders, 3 pieces of a chain that stretched back through decades and blood and the quiet heroism of people who showed up when showing up was the hardest thing in the world. Senior Chief Marcus Hale appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the counter in front of Sarah, sat down across from her, didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just heavy, weighted with things that needed to be said but didn't have easy words attached to them. "I lost a guy," Hale said finally. "Torres, 2 years ago. Forward aid station in Kandahar. Contract medic froze. Torres bled out while this guy just stood there." Sarah nodded. She knew. Kane had told her. Ghost had told her. Everyone who'd thought it would help explain Hale's hostility had told her. "I checked the dates on your FET deployment," Hale continued. His voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a man who was used to being in control and was discovering how little control actually mattered. "Helmand, 2014, you walked villages for 6 months, gathered intelligence." "Yes, that intelligence package for Operation Hammerfall, the one that told us where the compound was, where the guards were, where the weapons were stored, that was you. That was my team, 6 women. We worked together. 3 of my guys are alive because of that raid. Hale's hands on the coffee cup had gone white-knuckled. I got my silver star because of that raid. My promotion, everything that made me senior chief. Sarah waited. Let him work through it. Let him arrive at whatever conclusion he was building toward. And I spent 7 months treating you like you were nothing. You spent 7 months protecting your men from contractors who might not know what they were doing. That's your job. That's what good leaders do. Don't. Hale's voice cracked, just slightly. Don't make this easier for me. I was wrong. I judged you based on a contract and a bad experience, and I never once looked past that to see who you actually were. He set down the coffee cup, met her eyes, and Sarah saw something there that she recognized because she'd felt it herself. The particular weight of realizing you'd been carrying prejudice and letting it blind you to truth. Ghost called me from the hospital, Hale said. Told me about his nephew, the contractor who froze with Torres. Said he'd been carrying that guilt for 2 years. Said he understood why I didn't trust contractors, because he didn't trust them either after what his nephew did. Sarah stayed quiet. But he also said something else. Said I needed to learn the difference between incompetence and experience. Between someone who'd never been tested and someone who'd been tested 180 times and passed every single one. Hale picked up his coffee, took a sip, made a face because the coffee at FOB Keating was terrible and would always be terrible regardless of how much anyone complained. He told me about Captain Henderson, the corpsman who saved him in Vietnam. Said he spent 50 years watching warriors get overlooked because they didn't fit the mold. Said you were the first person he'd met since Henderson who reminded him what a real warrior looked like. Ghost sees things other people miss. Ghost sees things other people choose not to see because seeing them would require changing how we think. Hale set down the coffee. I want to make this right. Sarah finally picked up her own coffee. Terrible, burnt, bitter, but warm. And warmth mattered at 3 in the morning in a trauma bay in East Africa when you were trying to figure out how to move forward after everything had changed. Then trust the next person who doesn't look the part, she said. That's all I need. Not an apology, not special treatment, just see people. Really see them. Before you decide what they're capable of. Hale nodded slowly, stood, left his coffee cup, walked to the door, stopped. Anvil's a good call sign, he said without turning around. It's not a call sign. It's what Ghost called me once. It fits. Hale looked back. Anvils take the impact, stay solid, let everything else get shaped around them. That's what you did. For 7 months. For all of us. He left before Sarah could respond. She sat alone in the trauma bay holding her terrible coffee and wearing 3 bracelets that represented 3 different warriors who'd believed she was worth saving. Worth teaching, worth passing the torch to. We're okay, Hawk, she whispered to the empty room, to the ghost of her best friend who died teaching. We're okay. And for the first time in 6 years, she almost believed it. Phoenix, Arizona, 6 months later. The apartment looked exactly the same. Bare walls, single bookshelf, minimal furniture. Things that said someone existed here but didn't really live here. Except for the nightstand. 2 photographs sat side by side. The first was Elena's FET team. 6 women in body armor, 5 alive, 1 in Arlington. The second was new. 6 people standing in front of a dusty medical container in East Africa. Sarah in the center, Jake and Kane and Baptiste and Stern. And slightly apart, arms crossed, the ghost of a smile on his face, Marcus Hale. They were sunburned and tired and alive, and Sarah was smiling. The rare, transformative smile that changed her entire face and made her look like someone who'd found something worth holding on to. Next to the photos, 3 bracelets laid out carefully. Elena's memorial bracelet, Baptiste's paracord in scarlet and gold, Julia Henderson's POW bracelet with its worn bronze and careful inscription. Sarah picked them up one by one, slid them onto her wrists, Right hand, left hand, left hand. 3 reminders, 3 pieces of chain. The phone rang. Morgan. A pause on the other end. Then a familiar voice. Professional, military, carrying an offer that Sarah had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Staff Sergeant Morgan, this is Colonel Martinez, Marine Corps Training and Education Command. Colonel Reeves provided your name as a potential instructor for our new female engagement team training cadre at Camp Lejeune. We're expanding the program. Need experienced personnel who've actually walked the walk. Sarah looked at the photographs, at Elena who'd taught her, at Ghost who'd recognized her, at the chain of warriors stretching back through decades in blood, and the quiet work of showing up. When do I start? How soon can you get to North Carolina? Sarah smiled. When do you need me? Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, 3 weeks later. The classroom was full of young Marines, women mostly, a few men attached as support personnel, all of them fresh-faced and eager, and terrified in the way that people got terrified when they were about to do something that had never been done before and the outcome was uncertain. Sarah stood at the front of the room in her civilian clothes. Contractor status had certain advantages. She could teach without dealing with the bureaucracy of active duty, could speak freely, could tell the truth in ways that people in uniform sometimes couldn't. Behind her, standing in the doorway where he could observe without interfering, Ghost watched. Released from medical care, shoulder healed, still moving like he was 50 instead of 68, because some people just refused to admit they were old. My name is Sarah Morgan, she said to the class. I did 3 deployments to Helmand Province with the Lioness program and female engagement teams. I walked 180 patrols, participated in 23 direct fire engagements, earned a Bronze Star with Valor, and lost my best friend to an IED on Patrol 181. She let that settle. Let them absorb it. I'm not here to tell you that what you're about to do is easy. It's not. I'm not here to tell you that people will understand or respect or appreciate the work you're going to do. They won't. Not at first. Maybe not ever. Sarah walked to the board, picked up a marker, wrote 3 names. Captain Julia Henderson, CPL Elena Hawk Martinez, Colonel James Ghost Reeves. These 3 people taught me everything that matters about being a warrior. The first one I never met. She died before I was born. But her legacy was passed to me by someone who recognized that legacy in me. She turned to face the class, to face these young warriors who didn't know yet what they were capable of, who didn't know yet that showing up was 90% of the battle, and the other 10% was refusing to quit when showing up stopped being enough. The second one was my best friend, my FET partner. She taught me that presence matters more than procedure, that the most important thing we can give someone in their worst moment is the knowledge that they're not alone. Sarah touched the bracelet on her right wrist, Elena's name catching the light. The third one is standing in the doorway right now, probably glaring at me for putting him on the spot. He taught me that warriors recognize warriors, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is validate someone else's experience. Tell them they're seen. Tell them they matter. Ghost nodded once from the doorway, a nod that carried 50 years of hard-won wisdom and the satisfaction of watching the chain continue. You're about to join a tradition, Sarah said to her students, a chain of people who walked toward the fire when everyone else walked away, who sat with scared people in dangerous places and made them feel safe enough to trust, who gathered intelligence and saved lives and did it all without expecting recognition or reward or anything except the knowledge that it mattered. She picked up the marker again, wrote below the 3 names, to the next one. This is what I want you to remember when things get hard, when people doubt you, when you doubt yourself. You're not alone. You're part of something bigger, something that stretches back further than any of us can trace. And every time you show up and do the work, you're honoring everyone who came before and everyone who'll come after. Sarah set down the marker, looked at the young faces staring back at her, saw herself at 19, saw Elena at 24, saw every warrior who'd ever walked into something terrible and come out the other side with their humanity intact. "Welcome to the chain," she said quietly. "Don't break it." The room was silent, not the silence of people who didn't know what to say, the silence of people understanding something profound for the first time. The weight of legacy settling on young shoulders. The knowledge that they were part of something bigger. The class continued. Tactics, procedures, the technical knowledge that kept people alive in dangerous places. But underneath all of it, threading through every lesson, was the real education. The one that couldn't be taught from a textbook or a PowerPoint slide. Warriors recognize warriors. Presence matters more than procedure. You're never alone if you're part of the chain. And when the class ended and the students filed out and Sarah was left alone in the empty room, Ghost walked in, stood beside her, looked at the names on the board. "Julia would be proud," he said quietly. "I hope so. I know so." Ghost put a hand on her shoulder, brief, paternal, the gesture of a man who'd found someone worth fighting for and had fought for them and won. "You did good, Marine, real good." "So did you, sir." They stood there for a moment, two warriors, different generations, same chain, carrying the weight of everyone who'd come before and everyone who'd come after. Then Ghost smiled. "Buy you a terrible cup of coffee?" "Always." They walked out together, toward coffee that would be bad and company that would be good, and the satisfaction that came from knowing the chain would continue. That somewhere, someday, one of these young Marines would stand in front of a classroom and write new names on a board and tell new students that they were part of something bigger. The fire didn't care about your generation. It didn't care about your gender. It asked one question: are you a warrior? And only other warriors could truly answer. Sarah Morgan had her answer, had carried it through 3 deployments and 180 patrols, and one terrible day in a ditch in Nawa district when her best friend died teaching. She was a warrior, had always been a warrior, would always be a warrior. Not because of the uniform or the rank or the medals in a box somewhere gathering dust, but because she showed up, did the work, carried the weight, and passed it on to the next person who needed it. That was what warriors did. That was what mattered. That was enough.